Wonderful. All right. So we're going to pull up our quiz review here. And we got this shared out with you guys. So we're going to start with the left-hand column, and we'll just work our way down. So Appalachian Mountain Range, this is the oldest mountain range in North America. It's the Eastern Continental Divide. And in relation to this era and even present, this mountain range is rich in resources. And during the era of Native American and European contact, the Appalachian Mountain Range was home to numerous Native American tribes. Two of the significant tribes that we discussed in the southern portion of Appalachia were the Cherokee, and in the northeastern portion of Appalachia were the Iroquois. Moving on, we got the Colombian Exchange. The Colombian Exchange is the movement of goods crossing the Atlantic during and after the Age of Exploration. It got its name from Christopher Columbus. So we've got the Old World goods, everything from different agricultural plants, domesticated animals, disease, and even settlers themselves. And then from the New World going to the Old World, the Americas to Europe, we have various crops, we have various animals, we have various diseases. So this movement of goods is the Columbian Exchange. Moving down to Vikings, the Vikings were a group of intrepid explorers that not only explored but conquered much of Europe. They explored beyond Western Europe and Scandinavia in the North Sea and beyond into the Atlantic. In the late 900s, they were one of the first groups to arrive in Newfoundland, which is north of Maine in present-day Canada. They tried to establish a settlement there, but they gave up the settlement and returned back to Scandinavia. So they beat Columbus by about close to 500 years, arriving in the New World. We move on with Hernan Cortez. Cortez was the Spanish conquistador who will explore and ultimately, he'll explore everything from Mexico down to Honduras, but he will also conquer the powerful Aztec and lay siege to the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, which will ultimately become Mexico City. And that occurred in the 1520s, early 1520s. Next, we have encomienda. That was the Spanish system in which they enslaved natives, but there was a promise. What would they do for the natives in order to spread their culture? Very good. They would convert the natives to Christianity. The problem was a lot of these natives never got out of the system of encomienda and the system of slavery, and they were just held as chattel slaves, held as slaves for life. Next, we have King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. They were the king and queen of Spain who gave Columbus the go-ahead to find a southwest trade route to India and Asia. The trade route was not discovered, but Ferdinand and Isabella were able to benefit from the vast amount of wealth that Spain is going to obtain from the 4 voyages that were launched by Christopher Columbus. Do you guys need me to repeat any of those or need me to slow down? Wonderful. All right. Next, we moved to Cahokia. Remember, Cahokia was one of the largest empire cities that existed in North America. It was along the Mississippi River near present-day St. Louis, Missouri. And Cahokia was where the large mounds were built, these mound temples throughout the region of the Mississippian and the Hopewell people throughout the Mississippi River Valley. So the only other inhabited city that would have rivaled Cahokia would have been Tenochtitlan. Moving along, we have St. Brendan. Remember, he was the Irish monk who was a missionary to spread Catholicism, and he did so beyond the shores of Ireland. He is going to explore all over the place, trying to convert various pagans to Catholicism, and he is going to go beyond the shores of Ireland, and through Norse sagas, we believe that St. Brendan arrived and even explored Newfoundland prior to the arrival of the Vikings. He is also considered the patron saint of sailors and mariners. All right, maize and corn. This was the very important sustenance crop that was cultivated by the Olmec and the Mayan in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it spread north out of Mexico and into North America, well, into the continental United States as we know it today, and it spread into Central America and South America. And as we've discussed before, there's debate. Obviously the wild ancestor is there, but it had to be genetically modified by tribes over time in order to have the different styles of corn that were grown all over the Americas. And it will later become a significantly important cash crop. The Inca, this was the powerful tribe that was located in present-day Peru and parts of Chile in South America. They were one of the most powerful tribes in all the Americas, and their last emperor was Atahualpa. And remember, Atahualpa was ultimately conquered, and the Incan were conquered by the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro. We move down to the Treaty of Tortosius, or the Treaty of Tortosi. A lot of times you see it pronounced both ways. This was the treaty that was brokered between Spain and Portugal to divide up the lands that had been discovered in the Americas. So Spain got most of everything, but what area of South America did Portugal get that was very important to them? And these people in this country still speak Portuguese. Very good. What is it? Oh, you already said it. Sorry. Brazil. Excellent job. I was sitting there for a minute thinking, South America? South America? No. Excellent job. It was Brazil. All right. Moving right along, Juan Ponce de Leon. He was the Spanish conquistador who explored Florida and named Florida, or Florida, in honor of Spain. Was he searching for the Fountain of Youth? This is debatable, but we do know that he was searching for gold, and he will lay claim to Florida in honor of Spain. Moving down, we talked a little bit about Francisco Pizarro before. Pizarro was the conquistador who explored the west coast of South America, Peru and Chile, mostly Peru, and he was the conquistador who conquered the Inca and the last Incan chief or emperor, Atahualpa. Moving below Pizarro, we've got Francisco Coronado, and Coronado was in search of what were called the seven fabled cities of gold. Coronado did not find the fabled seven cities of gold, but what he did do is he explored pretty much everywhere from like Arizona, New Mexico to Kansas. He was the first conquistador to come across the Grand Canyon, come across buffalo herds, and the tribe that he is going to conquer will be the Pueblo. And no cities of gold were found. Before I move on to the next one, does anybody need me to repeat anything? Everybody feeling pretty good about the pace? All right. Tenochtitlan, this is the empire city and the capital of the Aztec, present-day Mexico City. They built this empire on Lake Texcoco. It was an amazing system of engineering. They built this canal system through these floating gardens known as chinampas, and this city will ultimately be under siege by Hernan Cortez and will be conquered by Cortez. Moving on, Pope's rebellion. This rebellion occurred in the late 1600s. It was led by a Pueblo religious leader or shaman by the name of Pope. And this was one of the largest native rebellions in the Americas. And what essentially happened was Pope and his followers not only attacked and killed Spanish settlers, but also burned Spanish missions, cathedrals, and Spanish colonial dwellings. Ultimately, the rebellion was put down. Next, we move to the quipu. The quipu was the system of rope knots that was used by the Inca to keep their records, to keep their history. They didn't have a written language, so that was the way in which they kept their historical, mathematical, and census records. And that was a clash of cultures between the Inca and the Spanish. The mita, this was the system in which the Inca used. It was sort of a socialistic system that required all members of the Incan Empire to provide labor back to the empire. So what we're going to see occur is, like farmers had to give a third of their crop yields, and soldiers and other members of the society had to work on roads and improve buildings and things of that nature. Vasco Nunez de Balboa, he was the Spanish conquistador who crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and he is going to be the first Spaniard to arrive at the Pacific Ocean, claiming the Pacific and much of the West Coast in honor of Spain. But he tries to lead a follow-up voyage and does not receive the blessing of the crown and will be tried for treason and usurping the crown and will be executed in Panama. King Charles I, he was the King of England after James I. He was a Catholic sympathizer, and he allowed for a large land grant to be provided to Lord Baltimore for a Catholic safe haven in colonial America. He'll later be challenged and beheaded by Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War, which is where he meets his demise. Moving on, the Virginia Company of London. This is the joint stock company that was founded to colonize Virginia and will launch the Jamestown settlement. They received their land grant from King James I. John Rolfe, really important Jamestown settler. He was not among the initial settlers in 1607. He'll arrive in 1610, a little bit later, and he does a couple of important things for the colony. Number one, he brings a Caribbean tobacco that he was able to blend with Virginia tobacco to make this sort of bittersweet tobacco that became sold all over Europe and save the colony. He will also marry Pocahontas. They'll have a child named Thomas, and their marriage is ultimately going to seal a period of peace between the English and the Palatine, but he'll later be killed in the 1622 attack that the Palatine launched on the Jamestown and Virginia settlers. And then finally, for the first column, we have King James I. He was the king after Elizabeth. He is going to keep the Anglican Church rolling, and he's going to resurrect the plan to colonize. He will give the Virginia Company of London their land grant, and he will be the namesake of the James River and the Jamestown settlement. Also the namesake of the King James Version of the Bible. Does anybody need me to repeat anything in the first column? All right, moving right along. Let's go to the top of the second column here. We have the Omec Heads. These were the colossal sculptures that were created by the Olmec in Central America and the Yucatan. Two significant places where the Omec Heads are today are La Venta and San Lorenzo, and it is absolutely amazing. Remember, the Olmec were the tribe that led to, they were like the mother tribe of what will become the Mayan. Marco Polo, so Marco Polo, remember, he's our sort of like Renaissance man when it came to exploration. He was gone on a 20-year expedition in China, India, and Indochina, and upon his return, he wrote the autobiography or memoir, The Travels of Marco Polo, that became kind of like the go-to manual and inspiration for the explorers that will come behind him, and it'll really push for this era of exploration in order to find a faster trade route to China, India, and the rest of Asia. Next, we have Prince Henry the Navigator. He was a Portuguese nobleman who will establish the School of Exploration in Sagres, Portugal, and this ultimately leads to the development of a series of innovative maritime and seafaring instruments. It also improves upon ships, and it puts Portugal sort of in the, in the lead, or at least a serious competitor in the exploration race moving into the 1500s. Bartholomew Dias, he'll be the Portuguese explorer that will be the first one to round the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. Our next explorer, Vasco da Gama, will follow up on the success of Bartholomew Dias, and he will actually go beyond the Cape of Good Hope, and he will explore the east coast of Africa, and he'll be the first to make it to India around the southern tip of Africa, at least the first European, and he will be named Viceroy of India upon his return to Portugal, basically like governor. Next, The Iroquois, this was the powerful tribe up in the northeastern woodlands in upstate New York. So they were like partly in part of Appalachia and into the Great Lakes region. They were 5 unified tribes, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the, Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and the Oneida. So these 5 tribes came together, and they came together under the leadership of a chief by the name of Hiawatha, and they came together because they had a couple of common enemies, and those enemies were the powerful Huron and the powerful Algonquian. They used lacrosse to train their warriors. Women had a significant role of influence and power in the tribe, and they are going to have a working constitution. And their tribe remained strong all the way up to the American Revolutionary era. The Mayan, this is the tribe that was born out of the Olmec. We see a lot of similarities between the Olmec and the Mayan, the Pocatoc ball game, astrology, mathematics, the cultivation of corn, bloodletting sacrifice. The Mayan also developed some pretty sophisticated commercial centers like Chichen Itza, Tulum, Tikal. Those are just a few. And their influence was from the Yucatan down into Central America, similar to that of the Olmec. So what led to the decline of the Maya? Historians believe both drought and civil war led to their demise. The Aztec, born out of the Mayan, so we see a lot of similarities between the Aztec and the Mayan. Creator gods like the Mayan feathered serpent Kukulkan and the Aztec feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl. The bloodletting sacrifice, training of warriors, etc. Remember the Aztec, they were located up in northern Mexico, present day Mexico City, and they will ultimately be conquered by Hernan Cortez. Does anybody need me to repeat any of those or have any questions thus far? Okay. Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci was a Italian ship captain and explorer who was a contemporary of Columbus. He explored for both Spain and Portugal, and he is going to explore much of the Caribbean as Columbus did, but he's also going to take it a step further and explore a whole lot more of South America than Columbus had, notably much of the coastline of Brazil. In fact, he gives Portugal those claims to Brazil, and the German cartographers are going to name the maps of the Americas in honor of Vespucci. They will be named North and South America. Next, smallpox. This was the devastating disease that could be contracted airborne that was absolutely brutal for the native population in the Americas. A lot of diseases killed the natives, but smallpox was the main killer. And the people that brought smallpox over were European and African settlers, explorers, slaves, etc. Also, a significant number of livestock that were brought over spread the disease, and the natives just didn't have the immunity for it. Palatine, the tribe and the chief, remember they were part of a larger tribe that we've discussed, the Algonquian. The Palatine dominated central and eastern Virginia all the way down into the Tidewater. Palatine controlled over 30 villages. He was one of the strongest Algonquian chiefs in the region, and that'll be the chief and tribe that will initially link up with the English explorers that settled at Jamestown. Moving on, Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan he's Portuguese, but he was hired by Spain to circumnavigate the globe. He doesn't make it. He will be killed in the Philippines, but part of his crew does return to Spain, and they'll be considered the first Europeans to circumnavigate the globe. Hernando de Soto, he had been a conquistador captain under Pizarro in the conquest of the Inca, and then he'll go on his own expedition to follow up on the Juan Ponce de Leon expedition of Florida. He's in search of the golden city of Appalachia, and he's going to explore beyond Florida all the way to the Mississippi River. Montezuma, or technically Montezuma II, he is not the last Aztec chief, but he's nearly the last Aztec chief. He will be the one that will be manipulated by Cortez, and obviously there's some historical dispute whether Montezuma was killed by his own people or whether he was killed by the Spanish. Nevertheless, upon his death, that is when the empire begins to collapse and fall apart. Father Junipero Serra, he was the Franciscan friar monk who led the Franciscan friar missionaries. These are a group of Catholic missionaries that established missions all the way up the west coast from San Diego, California to Sonoma. So he was not too far back. He was canonized as a saint, and he's also the inspiration for the mascot of the San Diego Padres, the baseball team, because of the fathers, these monks who were trying to convert natives to Catholicism. Anybody need more time or need me to repeat anything? Okay. Continuing in the second column, we have Samuel de Champlain. He was considered the father of New France. He was a French explorer who explored much of the east coast of North America and explored the St. Lawrence Seaway, and he established the trading post city of Quebec. And upon his establishment of the capital of New France, he is going to keep on keeping on and explore all the way out into the Great Lakes. The Bering Strait, or Beringia, this is the landmass that was formed in the last ice age when the oceans congealed and connected present-day Siberia to present-day Alaska, allowing hunter-gatherer migrant tribes to migrate from Eurasia into the Americas. And remember, they are going to populate the Americas for nearly 250 centuries. Pretty amazing. The Inquisition, this is the brutal tactics of torture and conquest warfare that were launched by the Spanish against the Islamic Moors in Spain and against natives in the Americas when they started to colonize. Next, we have French explorer Robert de La Salle. He was a cavalier, he was an explorer, and he was a sailor soldier. He is going to be the French explorer that explores the entire length of the Mississippi River Valley, and he will name all of the Louisiana Territory in the Mississippi River Valley in honor of the French king, King Louis XIV. the Sun King. Moving on, we have the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses was the first representative government that was established in colonial Virginia. It's established in Jamestown in 1619, and it is the oldest continuous representative government in North America because it ultimately will evolve into the Virginia General Assembly, the lawmaking body of Virginia during the era of the American Revolution and beyond. Next, we have the Middle Passage. This is the absolutely horrific and tragic area in which slaves were held on slave ships to be carried across the Atlantic to be sold into the institution of chattel slavery. There's an estimated somewhere between 8 to 20 million African slaves who were transported across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage. Next, we have Pocahontas. She was the daughter of Powhatan, one of many of his children. He had about 100 kids with 30 plus wives. She was his favorite. She helped cement a alliance with John Smith. Remember, Smith claimed that she saved his life. Obviously, that is still up for debate, whether it was part of a ritualistic ceremony or she truly did save his life. Nevertheless, they had an alliance. They didn't have a romantic relationship. She was very young at the time of Smith and the Jamestown settlers' arrival. As she gets older, she's going to meet John Rolfe. They will be married. This is going to be an era of peace between the Powhatan and the English in Jamestown. She'll be baptized, Christianized. Her native names were Pocahontas and Matoaka, but her English name was Lady Rebecca. She'll be sent to England to be accepted in King James I's court, but sadly she'll die of disease before she can return to Virginia. And then lastly, we have cash crops. These are cash crops were big money-making agricultural crops in colonial America. So your big money makers: sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, corn. Those are the big ones. Anybody need me to repeat anything in the second column? All right. On the top right, we have Henry Hudson. He was an English ship captain that was hired in the early 1600s by the Dutch East India Company, one of the powerful Dutch joint stock companies, to find a northwest passage to India and China. He didn't find that. He did find the Hudson River, and he laid claim to that area of present-day New York for the Dutch, and he will ultimately be abandoned by his crew after a mutiny in the bay farther north that bears his name, the Hudson Bay. New Amsterdam, that'll be the follow-up by the Dutch. The other Dutch trade company, joint stock company, the Dutch West India Company, will follow up on Hudson's land claims, and they are going to establish the colony of New Netherland and the settlement of New Amsterdam, which was their powerful trade post city in present-day New York City. They controlled this from 1624 to 1664. Did anybody have a question there? All right. Moving right along, Jamestown. This is the settlement in colonial Virginia that was established by the Virginia Company of London, the English joint stock company that got its land grant from King James I, and it was named for James I. It had a pretty disastrous beginning, but over time Jamestown will thrive thanks to tobacco. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, she was the daughter of Henry VIII. She is going to strengthen the Anglican Church of England. She is going to defeat the Spanish Armada, and she is going to attempt to colonize America by allowing for a land grant in present-day Outer Banks, Roanoke Island. She is the namesake for the Virginia colony, Virginia, the Virgin Queen. All right. Sir Francis Drake, he was Elizabeth's most trusted sea dog. He was a ship captain. He was a privateer, meaning he was a hired pirate by Elizabeth. He was an explorer, and he was a soldier sailor. He is going to be the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. He will be a hero against the Spanish Armada, and he will save the initial settlers at Roanoke Island. The first attempt, not the second. Roanoke Island. This is England's first attempt at colonization. It was explored by a group of settlers in 1584. Sir Walter Raleigh received the land grant, and Elizabeth allowed for this attempt to be made. The first attempt to settle was in 1585. It was an absolute disaster. Sir Francis Drake saved that group. Upon returning, the settlers obviously were faced with a significant group of problems: hostile natives, a really bad drought, and a lack of supply. So the leader of the Roanoke Island settlement, the second attempt, John White, returned to England, but when he came back, the colony was lost. They were not ever found again, and the only thing that was left was the word Croatan carved into one of the palisades or fence posts at their settlement. So that's why we refer to Roanoke Island as the Lost Colony. The Act of Toleration, I'm referring to the Maryland Religious Act of Toleration that allowed for all Christians to settle in colonial Maryland. The groups that were barred from settlement were Jews, atheists, and those who did not believe in the divinity of Christ. Moving right along, we've got James Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe was the soldier, governor, and philanthropist who started the Georgia colony. He also helps develop the port, settlement, and city Savannah, and he also barred slave labor and slave trade in Georgia in the first 10 years of the colony's existence. Remember, Georgia was established as a buffer colony against Spanish Florida and French Louisiana. The Anglo-Palatine Wars were the series of wars fought between the English and the Palatine from 1607 to the 1640s. Some of the more brutal events of the Anglo-Palatine War were the attacks launched by the English under the leadership of Lord Delaware, and the Palatine attacks in 1622, led by Palatine's brother, Chief Opicon Canoe. That was the attack that led to the death of John Rolfe and over 300 other settlers from Jamestown all the way up to Henricus, not far from Richmond, Virginia. Anybody need me to repeat any of these? Everybody good? Next, we have indentured servants. These were people who either voluntarily sold themselves into servitude or involuntarily were put into servitude. Your main groups that served as indentured servants were English, African, and Scots-Irish. Typically, their contracts lasted anywhere from 3 to 7 years. 7 years was the most common, but a lot of times their contracts were extended and they never saw their freedom in the end. They were sold for colonial labor. Next, we have John Smith. He was the controversial leader and governor of Jamestown in the early years. He took leadership in 1607, even though most of the settlers didn't want him to be the leader, and he is going to institute the no work, no food policy to get everybody working to build the settlement. He is also going to create an alliance with the Palatine as well, and he does a significant amount of exploring in Virginia. He will later be injured in a gunpowder accident, and he will return to England and will never come back to Jamestown. Lord Baltimore, I'm referring to two individuals here. I'm referring to George Calvert and his son Cecilius Calvert. George Calvert was the individual that received the land grant for Maryland by King Charles I, but he died before the colony could take off. So his son Cecilius Calvert took over the colony, and colonial Maryland, safe haven for Catholics, and Baltimore town becomes the leading commercial port center in colonial Maryland. The Anglican Church of England was the established Church of England that was led by Henry VIII, and it was continued and strengthened under Elizabeth I and James I. A number of Anglicans are going to settle in colonial Virginia, and especially in the colonial South. So Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. There will be some Anglicans that settle in Maryland as well. Joint stock company. Joint stock companies were groups that pooled their money together to either pay for expeditions, exploration, settlements, or the development of trading posts. So the Virginia Company of London is an example of a joint stock company. John Cabot, Giovanni Caboto, was the Italian ship captain who was hired by England to find a northwest passage to Indian Asia. He ends up landing in Newfoundland, north of Maine, and he claims everything from Maine to Georgia in honor of England and King Henry VII. Primogeniture. Primogeniture was that policy and law in England and other parts of Europe that said that the oldest born male received all of the inheritance of the family. This is what leads to a lot of English men, even noblemen, who were not first born to come to America with the hopes of owning land. Chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is the system in which slaves were held for life and their offspring were also held for life. And this was mainly directed at African slaves in the late 1600s and beyond. The Black Legend, this was the propaganda campaign in Europe that blamed Spain for the brutal Inquisition treatment of natives in the Americas, with the hopes that other European nations would be able to come and settle and provide the natives with a better life and a pathway to Christianity. But the irony of the Black Legend is that all the European nations, with the exception of France, were all practicing their own form of the Black Legend. St. Augustine, Florida, this was the settlement that was established by the Spanish. It was and is the longest inhabited settlement in the continental United States. It was also the home to a citadel fortress to defend the settlement against attack from rival nations. King Charles II, he was the king that restored the crown after the death of Oliver Cromwell, and he is ultimately going to lead a colonial boom time during his reign because he owes a lot of people money for the restoration, and he also wants to make money off of colonization and natural resources coming out of the Americas. One of the large colonies that he is going to issue massive land grants to develop will be the Carolinas. And we're going to continue to talk about Charles II in the colonial period. Lord Delaware, I know it looks like De La War, but it's Delaware. Lord Delaware is the military leader that comes to Jamestown in 1610 with a military force, supplies, and a relief party. He is going to launch a series of attacks and raids on the Powhatan that are referred to as the Irish tactics, because he had served against the Irish uprising that we discussed during Elizabeth's reign. And this is ultimately going to be like scorched earth type warfare against the Powhatan. He'll later be recognized and his name will be honored by two significant namesakes. The Lenape tribe will be renamed the Delaware, and the colony of Delaware will be named in his honor. The triangular trade route is the area across the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas, from the Americas to Europe, and from Europe to Africa, with the movement of natural resources from the Americas to Europe, finished products from Europe to Africa, and Africa, the movement of slaves and finished products. And then lastly, Bartholomew Gosnell. Gosnell was one of the key leaders of the Virginia Company of London. One is one of the early leaders of the Jamestown settlement. He had done a significant amount of exploring. He explored Cape Cod. He named Martha's Vineyard, and he would be a more well-remembered leader of the Virginia Company of London and the Jamestown settlement had he lived longer. He didn't make it very long in the early years of Jamestown. He died within the first year of settlement. Does anybody need me to repeat any of those? All right. Thank you very much.